Thank you, members. Next on government business today is statements on the Bessborough development, and I now call on Minister Norma Foley to make her statement under Standing Order 56. And Minister, you have 25 minutes.
I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today on developments at the site of the former mother and baby institutions at Bessborough. The legacy of the mother and baby institutions is a deeply sad one that continues to be a source of profound hurt and pain for many, many people right across this country. I'm really conscious of the sensitivity of the issue, particularly for survivors and former residents of the Bessborough institution, as well, of course, for their families. Indeed, there may well be members in the public gallery today who were born in Bessborough or who had family members there. The Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes was established in 2015 to investigate and report on a range of issues associated with mother and baby home institutions. One of those was Bessborough Mother and Baby Home. As the Commission's report documented, the Congregation of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and Mary had been invited to set up a mother and baby home in Cork by the head of the Cork Board of Guardians. The congregation decided to purchase Bessborough House, a large Georgian house on 210 acres. It opened Bessborough Mother and Baby Home in 1922. While it was owned and run by the congregation, it was largely paid for by public funding. Inspections of Bessborough Mother and Baby Homes was carried out by the Department of Local Government and Public Health. One diligent and determined inspector, Alice Lister, raised the alarm about the fact that 70 of the 114 children admitted to Bessborough in the year ending the 31st of March 1943 had died. All but one of the infants were under 1 year old. As the Commission's report documented, Ms Lister identified the unsatisfactory milk supply to the home and the failure to breastfeed as the main cause of the high death rate and the unhealthy condition of the children. She later recommended that Bessborough should be closed for new admissions for at least 3 months. Up to the start of 1945, no serious steps were taken by either the congregation, the South Cork Board of Public Assistance or the Department of Local Government and Public Health to address the problem. But finally, in January of 1945, the Department of Local Government and Public Health decided to implement Ms Lister's recommendations to close Bessborough for new patients for a period. The Mother Superior in charge of Bessborough was subsequently replaced. In December of 1945, the Department of Local Government and Public Health wrote to the County Council and Boards of Public Assistance to inform them they could resume sending pregnant mothers to Bessborough. This is just one of the aspects of the decades-long history of Bessborough examined in the final report of the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes. In total, 9,768 mothers and 8,938 children were admitted to Bessborough until it closed in 1998, which is not that very long ago. The Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes had wide-ranging powers and conducted very extensive inquiries, searches and test excavations at institutional sites in an effort to locate the burial places of children. The Commission made extensive efforts to try and establish where the children who died at Bessborough were buried. The Commission examined the records of the deaths in the institution and cross-referenced these with information provided by the General Register's Office. It also reviewed the records compiled in the institution and confirmed there was no information about burial arrangements there. The Commission was particularly concerned that none of those who were involved in the running of the institution were able to identify the burial place of the children who died there. Given the lack of documentary evidence, the Commission engaged forensic archaeologists to carry out cartography assessment of possible unrecorded burial arrangements in the grounds. The forensic archaeologists and the Commission's researchers reviewed all available cartography sources and aerial images. A site survey was also conducted. Whilst there are a number of locations within the grounds where burials could have taken place, there was no evidence found of burials anywhere except the congregation burial ground, which is not nearly large enough for the number of children involved. The Commission also examined aerial photography taken by the Irish Air Corps in 1951. This is interesting because the large majority of child deaths at Bessborough occurred before this date, and the Commission's view was that if there were burials in the grounds, high-resolution aerial photographs would show some ground disturbance or anomaly on the landscape to give some indication of where remains might be located. However, there were no visible features on the Bessborough landscape that indicated any obvious site of the remains of such a large number of children. In addition, the Commission issued a national public appeal seeking information from individuals who may have information about the burial places of children who died in Bessborough. All information was followed up. The locations identified as possible burial sites, some of which have now been built on, were assessed by forensic archaeologists, but no evidence was produced to suggest that any of the identified sites contain human remains. The Commission also actively investigated the possibility that former residents of Bessborough might have been buried in other locations. It examined the burial records of burial grounds that were in operation in the area. Whilst it identified some burials, it was unable to establish the burial location of the majority of children who died while resident at the institution. The Commission considered that it is likely that burials did take place in the grounds of Bessborough, but despite its extensive investigations, it was unable to find any evidence of a location. It considered that the only way that it can be established if burials did take place in the grounds is by an excavation of the entire property, including the parts of the former 200-acre estate that have now been built on, which it did not consider feasible. While I understand there have been calls for further investigations, it is really important to note that there are very differing views among survivor groups about how the site should now be treated. I am aware that planning permission has recently been granted for the building of apartments on a portion of the privately owned land at the Bessborough site. For the record, I must be clear, the State does not own the land in question. The Government's response to the legacy of mother and baby institutions is set out in the Action Plan for Survivors and Former Residents of Mother and Baby and County Home Institutions. On foot of the Action Plan, in November of 2022, the Minister for Housing, Local Government and Heritage wrote to local authorities, including Cork City Council, requesting that development plan processes give adequate consideration to incorporating appropriate measures to ensure the protection of unrecorded burial sites associated with an institution. While planning decisions are a matter for the relevant planning authorities, the circular issued by the Minister noted that in assessing planning applications at such locations, evidence of unrecorded burial sites should be treated as a material consideration, and that appropriate conditions may be attached to potential developments. My predecessor, Minister Roderick O'Gorman, also brought the findings of the Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Investigation to the attention of Cork City Council and An Bord Pleanála, highlighting the unresolved questions with regard to the location of burials on the site, and where any development takes place at the site, the need for that to involve archaeological investigation and ongoing monitoring. I note that in the permission that was recently granted, Cork City Council has attached a number of conditions, including requirements to have a forensic archaeological monitoring strategy and a forensic archaeologist in place to monitor excavation at the site every single day. It is also specified that if human remains are located, all work on site should cease and relevant authorities should be informed. Forensic archaeologists are professionals that work on the recovery of human remains, including in the context of modern crime scene investigations. It is important to state here that if the development commences and remains are uncovered during excavation for building purposes at the Bessborough site, it may then be appropriate for those remains to be excavated under the provisions of the Institutional Burials Act 2022. The profound importance of both local and national memorialisation is clear from engagements with survivors and former residents. The Government's action plan contains commitments in relation to dignified local memorialisation of known or agreed burial sites. The Minister for Housing, Local Government and Heritage established a working group of departmental and local authority officials to advance the commitment to local memorialisation. Officials in the relevant departments will work together with a view to bringing forward proposals to support inclusive, survivor-led local memorialisation. Another key commitment in the Government's action plan is the development of a national memorial and records centre. In March of 2022, Government approved high-level proposals for a national centre for research and remembrance to be located on Sean McDermott Street in Dublin. It will stand as a site of conscience to honour equally all those who spent time in industrial schools, Magdalen laundries, mother and baby and county home institutions, reformatories and related institutions, and all those who have lived experience of Ireland's historical adoption and boarded-out systems. The National Centre will stand as part of our national institutions and will comprise a museum and exhibition space, the development of which will be led by the National Museum of Ireland, a research centre and repository of records related to institutional trauma in the 20th century, which will form part of the National Archives, and a garden space for reflection and remembrance. There has been significant progress in the development of the centre. In July of 23, Government approved the master plan for the National Centre campus and the preliminary business case for the main National Centre buildings. In March of 24, Government approved further key project documents, including the preliminary business case for the full National Centre campus. An application for planning permission was submitted in November of 24, and planning permission was granted by Dublin City Council in February of 25. Enabling works are currently underway at the site, and main works are expected to commence later this year. Survivor members were recently appointed to the steering group that is driving the overall coordinated development of the National Centre campus. In addition to survivors, the steering group membership includes the Special Advocate for Survivors and representatives of relevant state bodies. Whilst physically situated in Dublin, the National Centre will be accessible for all survivors and affected persons in other parts of Ireland and abroad. This will be made possible through the provision of digital access to some records and exhibits. In addition, it is envisaged that physical presences will be developed elsewhere, including in conjunction with some local museums, to enable survivors to visit more easily. In conclusion, I fully acknowledge the trauma that must come with not knowing the burial location of one's family members. I acknowledge that the application to build on privately owned lands at Bessborough and the granting of planning permission for that application has reawakened so much of that trauma. I'd like to express my sincere understanding of how difficult this has been for mothers who stayed in Bessborough and children who were born there.
Thank you, Minister. And just want to welcome, if there's any persons that are in the public gallery that's associated with Bessborough development, to welcome them here to the chamber. We now move on to the next speaking slot, a 15-minute slot for Sinn Féin Party. 3 speakers: Deputy O'Leary, Deputy Clark and Deputy Goons. Deputy O'Leary, 5 minutes.
Minister, I'm going to talk about Bessborough, but I'm also going to talk about the entire system in terms of mother and baby homes, industrial schools and county homes, because we've had so many apologies in this House, and rightly so, and welcome. But too often I feel that the state has failed to truly get to grips with what was actually in place in this state, and that is an entire system that was integrated between county homes, between Magdalen laundries, between mother and baby homes, between industrial schools. That was, to say it was a dark period of our history is an understatement, and I return to that because it isn't merely history. But this was an entire system that had the imprimatur of the state, that the state was entirely complicit in. And the state's response has always been to treat it as piecemeal, a bit of wrongdoing here, these institutions were wrong here, instead of really confronting the fact that the state fully endorsed and fully was part of the system and to a large extent relied on the system. I also think that there hasn't been a frank and honest recognition of the pain that was caused, and I think the most obvious example of that was the heartlessness of the 6-month limit for compensation under the mother and baby home scheme, as if the trauma of separation was any less for those who fell under that bracket, as if that separation, we know now very clearly that trauma exists right from birth, and that separation that would have been created, I think it was one of the most callous proposals and decisions adopted by any government in recent years. And to look at Bessborough, how it puts it into stark repair. Yes, we can all acknowledge the fact that maternal health in the 40s and 50s in Ireland was not what it should have been. But to say that the standards in Bessborough fell below that doesn't even begin to cover it. Public health reports looking at an infant mortality rate of 82% in some years in the 40s. That the cause of death of some 20% of the deaths in Bessborough in the 40s and 50s was marasmus, a form of severe malnutrition. People dying in Cork in the 40s and 50s in Bessborough for want of food, for want of nutrition. But it's important to say as well that this is not only history, and we would make a profound mistake to treat this as only a period that can be looked back on and to be examined in a historical context. There are people in this gallery, there are people watching in, whose brothers, sisters, mothers were in Bessborough. And for those people, this is profoundly real. And this is about being able to identify where their loved ones were buried. That is what we're talking about. I was at an oral hearing for one of the previous applications, thankfully refused, and I remember a debate between esteemed, capable people who had different opinions on how to interpret old Ordnance Survey maps. And trying to say that one set of experts was trying to say, well, the marking there for burial ground represents the Order's burial ground over here, and another expert saying that no, very clearly, this burial ground could potentially have been there. But which of them was right? The point of it, and what stayed with me since then, is that this was no ordinary housing application. This was a housing application that was talking about whether or not there were children buried there. That was the fundamental point. And it is no ordinary planning application before us now where that has been discussed. I know it's not strictly before us. It is profoundly wrong and is hurtful to build there. And I know the government will say that they can't interfere in planning locations, but there could have been a government intervention with the Institutional Burials Bill. And it's not only in Bessborough, it's in Shanborough and other locations across the state. The government should have recognised, we've been talking about this issue in these houses in terms of the institutions and where children were buried. Some 700 children who died at Bessborough are unaccounted for. We don't know where they're buried. It's absolutely appalling. And this is in the context of, you know, I've talked about the state's complicity in this. You know, a story just reported today that the State Chief Medical Advisor, James Deaney, communicated to Bessborough that they would put aside their investigation if the death rate continues to decline. That's what we're talking about here. And we're talking about the potential burial place of children. So the government needs to find some legislative mechanism to ensure that sites such as this and across the state are protected, because this isn't the only location.
Deputy Clerk.
Minister, the decision to grant planning permission for a residential development on the site of the former Bessborough Mother and Baby Home in Cork, in my opinion, is deeply wrong. It's deeply troubling and it's profoundly disrespectful to the women and to the children who lived there, who suffered there and who died there. Bessborough is not just another development site, it's a place of trauma, of loss and of gross injustice. It's a place where women were confined, where children died and where families are still searching for the truth. We cannot discuss planning at Bessborough as if it is comparable to any other planning application in the state, as if it is simply another zoned map. This is about history, it's about accountability and it's about human dignity and the real impact that Bessborough still has on those who were there today. This decision risks erasing history. It risks erasing the often horrific lived experiences of women and their children. These are not distant abstract stories. You mentioned 1998 yourself, Minister. I was a mother in 1998. These are real people who suffered real injustices at the hands of both the state and the church. They are sisters, they are aunts, they are daughters, they are mothers, they are children. They are families who were failed and who continue to be failed. We know that hundreds of people, mothers and children, died in Bessborough during its years of operation. We know that for some of those who died there are no records. We know that the Commission itself said it's highly likely that burials took place on the grounds. In that context, how can any development proceed in good conscience without first establishing the full truth? And I acknowledge your opening statement and the recognition of a forensic archaeologist, Minister, but to my mind, that simply isn't good enough. This week, academics and human rights experts warned that allowing large-scale development on this site risks undermining Ireland's obligations to properly investigate locations connected to mother and baby homes. They raise serious concerns that the full extent of burials may not yet be known, and that concerns also around construction could proceed without questions being answered. These warnings cannot be ignored. They must be taken seriously by government and by the planning authorities. Sinn Féin has been clear and consistent on the legacy of mother and baby homes. Survivors and families must come first. Successive governments' records on this has been one of delay, of exclusion and of avoidance. The Commission of Investigation established 10 years ago and the sealing of the records to the redress scheme that excluded survivors. There has been repeated failures to confront the truth. And now once again we're faced with a decision that appears to prioritise moving on over finding out what really happened and attempting to bring some level of closure to those women who suffered so horrifically within those walls. There is no doubt that we need housing, and Sinn Féin supports development, but we support the development of homes in the right place at the right time and not at the cost of covering up the truth or stripping further dignity. We cannot build over sites where there are still unanswered questions about unmarked graves, about missing records and about the fate of children who died in state-supported institutions. If this development proceeds without full investigation, without proper consultation with survivors and without ensuring that all burial grounds are identified and treated with respect, then the state will be failing these women and children all over again. There must be an immediate action to safeguard this site. There must be a full and thorough examination of the grounds as required. Survivors and families must be consulted and listened to. Local memorialisation must be provided, and no development should proceed until the truth is fully established. The Taoiseach himself has said that the state failed mothers and children in these institutions, but words must mean something. Because if we allow this site to be built over without first establishing what lies beneath, then not only is history just being neglected, it is being actively erased. Survivors have endured unimaginable trauma. I can't imagine the trauma of not knowing where a loved one is buried. They should not be re-traumatised by decisions taken without them about their history and against their wishes. A grave injustice was done. It cannot and must not be covered over. Sinn Féin is determined to secure the truth and justice for survivors of mother and baby homes and for those who did not survive. Their strength, their resilience and what must seem like an ever reopening of scars and traumatic events cannot continue to be inflicted upon by the state or any arms of its apparatus.
Minister, 18,000 women and children went through or spent time in Bessborough. It closed in 1998. But this is just not a historic wrongdoing. It's a modern one right up to today. There are people who still bear the scars and the trauma. Just, I suppose, to give a feel of it, John O'Brien died on the 3rd of November 1922. He was 10 months old, a young little baby now, probably laughing, able to clap and what have you. He was the first child to die in Bessborough. And Zoe Bonny died on the 10th of August 1994. She would have been 32 this year. She was only 2 days old, and she was the last baby to die in Bessborough. So, from John to Zoe, 921 other children died on that site. Now, I don't have the time here, unfortunately, to name each and every one of those, but for Zoe and for John and for all those whose lives were lost too soon and whose stories, their stories cannot be erased from history. And I believe the state owes it to them to make sure that happens. They weren't given dignity in life, but at least they should be given dignity in death. Over 923 children died. 64 graves, 64 have only been found. And it's hard to wrap your head around the number of children, babies and mothers who died in Bessborough. It's unbelievable. And today's date, the 26th of March, there was 3 children died in that date over the years. There was John Collin, 1 month old, who died in 1923. Kieran Lennon, who was 6 months old, who died in 1945. and Vincent Joseph Finn, who was 2 days old when he died in 1959. There are no graves to visit them today to remember them, no headstones to mourn them, no dignity in their death. The atrocities that were inflicted on them in life continues in their death. People use the phrase to sweep it under the carpet about Ireland's approach to mother-baby homes throughout the 20th century. But no, instead of sweeping it under the carpet, it's going to be swept underneath apartment blocks and concrete. How can that be right? What is planned is wrong and must not go ahead. This government must step in. The solution is to properly investigate where these babies are buried, to find their graves and to give them the peace in death. We will be making a submission to appeal the planning permission, and I want to state strongly here on the Dáil record, I object to it. I object to any development on this site until all investigative means have been used to identify where every child and mother is buried. I object on behalf of Zoe and John and all of the hundreds of babies who have had their chance of dignity in life and in death robbed from them. I object on behalf of Nellie Sweetman, who was 86 when she died after decades in Bessborough, and to Josephine Larkin, who was only 20 when she died of shock after extensive burns on her body. The Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Investigation didn't use all means necessary, and neither Cork City Council nor on Commission Penola can see the results of their investigation. And that's wrong. How can you make a decision without seeing the investigation? Planning should never have been approved, and it must now be refused. The government should CPO this site and carry out the investigations. I attended a visual recently. The level of upset was just indescribable. It's just hard to imagine the heartbreak that people have when they heard that apartments were going to be built on this site. And I just want to take my final moment to thank those who made sure that Zoe and John and every other baby in Bessborough will never be forgotten. I want to particularly mention Carmen Cantwell, whose fight for Willem has shown what an excellent sister that she is for fighting for Willem. And just to say, there's a vigil there every summer. I would encourage anyone to go to it, to listen to the stories of the people and the mothers and the children of Bessborough.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Gould. We now move on to the Labour Party slot, which is 10 minutes. Deputy Kenny, Deputy Ahern and Sheehan, and we have 4, 3 and 3. Thank you.
Minister, when we speak about Bessborough, we are not speaking about an abstract planning file or a routine decision before a local authority. We are speaking about a place that goes to the very core of who we are, or who we claim to be as a republic. There are moments when politics must step back from process and confront conscience. This is one of those moments. The history of mother and baby homes is not distant or detached. It is raw, it is painful, and it remains unresolved for far too many families. Bessborough in particular stands as one of the most starkest symbols of that legacy. Nearly 19,000 women and children pass through its doors. That is not just a figure. It is a measure of suffering on a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend. We must be honest about what that means. These were women and children who endured conditions that no person should ever have to face. Their experiences were marked by stigma, by silence, and by a profound absence of compassion from the state and society alike. So when proposals come forward to develop this land, we cannot treat it as just another site. This is not simply about housing supply or zoning decisions. It is about moral responsibility. It is about memory. It is about whether we have truly learned anything from our past. Over 900 babies are believed to have died at Bessborough. As my colleague Senator Laura Harman has pointed out, the majority of these children remain unaccounted for, and the site itself may in fact contain a mass grave. And that is the crux of it. Truth matters. It matters to survivors. It matters to relatives. And it must matter to us as legislators. To proceed with development in the absence of a full and thorough investigation would not just be premature, it would be wrong. It would risk closing off avenues to truth that have already been denied for decades. It would send a message that expediency can have precedent over dignity. My colleague on Cork City Council, Councillor Peter Horgan, has been extremely clear on this. This is a deeply painful and shameful chapter in Ireland's history, and any future of the site must be guided by sensitivity, transparency and respect. It should, most importantly, be conscious of the pain and suffering of survivors. We in the Labour Party have urged the Minister for Housing to use powers under Section 28 of the Planning Act to protect places like Bessborough from development, yet they have failed to do so. That is why Councillor Horgan has lodged a planning objection against the site. We have to ask ourselves difficult questions. What does it say about us if we have built over ground that may contain unmarked graves? What does it say to those who lived through these institutions or who lost loved ones out there? Because for many, Bessborough is not history. It is a lived experience. It is a grief that has not yet found closure. It is questions that remain unanswered. Now let me be clear. This is not an argument against housing. We all recognise the urgency of the housing crisis, particularly in a growing city like Cork. But the issue here is not whether we build, it is where we build and how we build. There are alternatives. There are vacant and derelict sites that can and should be prioritised. What is being asked here is not unreasonable. It is simply that we approach this particular site with the care, sensitivity and respect it demands. Ultimately, this comes down to respect. Respect for the women who were sent there. Respect for the children who never left. Respect for the families who are still seeking truth. We have a choice. We can face our history in full, however uncomfortable that may be, or we can turn away from it. But if we choose to turn away, we diminish not just our past, but our integrity as a society. Bessborough is not just land, it is a memory and it deserves to be treated as such.
Thank you, Deputy Ahern.
And I'd like to express my solidarity today with the survivors of the Bessborough Mother and Baby Home and survivors of all mother and baby homes as we broach this issue today. And we're talking about a matter of great sensitivity relating to the disappearance of hundreds of women and babies. And this is a matter of basic human dignity for survivors and for those, the babies and the mothers, who didn't survive. We're also talking about what exactly does it mean when the state makes an apology for something? When the state is making plenty of apologies these days, but what do they mean? We all know what a hollow apology sounds and feels like. So how do we know, and how does our state express that it's actually sorry when it comes to survivors of mother and baby homes? There always tends to be a focus on the financial redress side of a state apology, but justice, true justice, requires a much broader and a much more holistic approach than simple financial restitution. That's the easy part, and we're not even getting that right by putting up arbitrary barriers based on time spent in institutions if you want to apply for these things. But a genuine apology requires self-reflection, and it requires changed attitudes and behaviours, changed attitudes to people who may have previously been excluded and looked down on, changed approaches to how the state conducts its business so that the failures, the sins of the past are not repeated. And it requires truth-seeking and truth-telling, reflection and memorialisation. We know that of the 923 babies who died at Bessborough, 859 are entirely unaccounted for. The location of the remains of 19 mothers is also unknown. The Commission of Investigations reports that it's highly likely that burials took place on the grounds at Bessborough. So the absence of certainty around the location of the remains of those who died at Bessborough is precisely why planning permission was refused for a redevelopment here by On Board Clonola in 2021. Nothing has changed in the interim. And we can't atone for Bessborough, this national shame, by bulldozing it and paving over the memories of those who lost their lives there. And we know the Special Advocate for Survivors, Patricia Carey, has spoken about how this proposal has been re-traumatising for survivors. And Minister, I'm sure you've seen the letter written by a number of human rights lawyers and academics from the University of Galway to An Commission Pleanála today regarding the site, and you'll be aware that the state has failed to comply with its obligations under the European human rights law with regards to the deaths and disappearances here. So, Minister, we need to heed the calls from the survivors.
And I thank the Government Chief Whip for facilitating time for this debate at my request. I was struck, Cathaoirleach, by something my colleague Deputy O'Leary said earlier on in relation to the tendency by the state to treat these the issues of institutional abuse as piecemeal and individual. Because if you look at industrial schools, Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, the fact of the matter is that this was incarceration that was funded by the state and facilitated by a corrupt institution, the Roman Catholic Church. And I was struck by some aspects of the Minister's speech in relation to no information about burial arrangements. And while you stated, Minister, that there are a number of locations within the grounds where burial could have taken place, there was no evidence of burial found anywhere except the congregation burial ground. And it brings me back to an experience in my own family, because my grandaunt was in a mother and baby home in the 1950s. Her child was taken from her. Her child was sent to Australia. We only found this out about 10 or 12 years ago, and she could not make contact with her biological daughter for decades afterwards, and there was no paperwork surrounding her daughter's birth, registration of birth. It was all extremely difficult to obtain. And I note the previous applications, the application that was there for an SHD, where this was ruled by Board Pleanála as being unsuitable. The fact of the matter is that the Bessborough site requires a national intervention to prevent development. The state has obligations under the ECHR to investigate this, and it should be responsible for surveying and protecting the site itself. This should not be something that should be left to any private entity. And some of the rhetoric that's coming from government in relation to this is markedly different and departs from what the official policy position is, because the Taoiseach himself said Cork City Council should have purchased it. The Taoiseach said he was deeply uncomfortable, and Minister O'Callaghan said the solution wasn't to CPO the site. I think that the state needs to step in here, that this should be a site of conscience, it should be a site of national commemoration, because the way survivors have been treated here, as survivors are consistently treated by the official mechanisms of the state, is absolutely appalling. And the fact of the matter is that we're only two people, Carmel Cantwell and my colleague, Councillor Peter Horgan, who went and bothered to lodge a formal objection to this. The Minister for Housing has powers under Section 28. He can issue ministerial guidelines.
Thank you, Deputy. We now move on to the government slot. Deputy Seamus McGrath, you have 10 minutes.
Thanks very much, Cathaoirleach. And at the outset, I do want to thank the Minister and the Government for facilitating the statements here today. It's absolutely necessary. As we all know, Bessborough represents a very dark chapter in our past. It's a very long chapter from 1922 to 1998, and indeed a recent chapter. It's not that long ago since Bessborough closed its doors. The history of what went on in Bessborough, some of it is known and some of it is unknown, but certainly there were horrors in relation to Bessborough, and as I say, some of that is documented, but much of it is not. As we have outlined here today, 9,768 women and girls went through Bessborough, and 8,938 children experienced Bessborough. That's over 18,000 human beings, as Deputy Gould referred to earlier. 923 children died in Bessborough, and as we know, only a very tiny number of those are accounted for. So these facts are stark and very, very significant. And I do acknowledge that the Commission of Investigation undertook work in relation to the Bessborough site, and that has to be acknowledged. But it also concluded that it is likely there are further burial sites in relation to Bessborough, and the fact that it said they have found no evidence as to where they may be located, in my view, should not in any way be used as a reason to suggest that the Bessborough site can be developed. We absolutely need to err on the side of caution in relation to this. 923 children died, and that is a very, very stark figure in terms of our past as a country. And in terms of the role of Cork City Council, and I note that there has now been a unanimous motion, as I understand it, in terms of the CPO of this site. I personally do not understand how the Council has not been more proactive over the years in terms of the Bessborough site. As someone who served on Cork County Council for many years, in the development plan, councillors have a lot of powers in terms of zoning of land and designating and categorising land, and I genuinely do not understand how Bessborough was not protected in various city development plans over the years. I think that was a mistake. I think that was unfortunate, but that is where we are now. And as we know, there is now a planning permission in place. And as someone who's a housing spokesperson for my party, I'm speaking week in, week out in relation to the need for housing supply, in relation to the housing crisis and how that is impacting on our citizens. And it is impacting our citizens in a very acute way. And we need housing, absolutely. But there are limits to that, and there are exceptions to that. And I think this particular situation is an exception to that. And I have no difficulty in saying that, as a housing spokesperson, that I do not believe this should be developed. And I may come in for some criticism in relation to that, given my role as a housing spokesperson, but I absolutely stand over it. There are exceptions to everything, and this is one of them, given the very dark past, as I said, that has occurred here in relation to Bessborough. And I am asking that the government does everything possible to find a different way forward here. And I think it is possible to find an alternative way forward here. As public representatives, we all know the reality. There is a planning permission. It is appealed to An Commission Planola, and if that is allowed, follow through on its course, there will be a decision. So I think there is a window there for the government to consider what it can do in relation to this. And I acknowledge the options are limited potentially, but I think there is scope there to look at this. And again, I do thank the Minister for being here and for listening to us today in relation to this. And there are family members of survivors and survivors with us here today in the public gallery, and I acknowledge them making the journey from Cork to come up here as well to listen to the debate in the House here today, which is so important. This is a large site. As one deputy has said earlier, in my view, it should be a site of conscience. It should be a site that's protected, that's preserved, in respect of those who experience Bessborough and in respect of their family members. I believe we have a duty as public representatives to work together and collectively to try and find a way forward here that meets those needs better. And I am asking that the government does this. We need to err on the side of caution here, and that is what I am asking happens. Thank you, Cathaoirleach.
Thank you very much, Deputy McGrath. We now move on to the Social Democrats speaking slot. You have 10 minutes with Deputy Rice, Deputy Cummins, Deputy Gannon and Deputy Gibbon. 3-3-2-2.
Minister, today's statements on Bessborough are welcome and very important, but they'll be meaningless unless the government takes action on foot of the debate today. And I would urge the Minister to listen to the speeches from across the House, including members of our own party who are calling on the government to intervene here. The bottom line is apartments should not be built on what is very likely a mass grave. It would not be accepted anywhere else, and we cannot accept it here. Neil shakes heart, Minister. Last week I spoke at a protest outside the gates of Leinster House. And Minister, I want to say to you directly what I said to survivors and their supporters at that gathering. I was very recently at a vigil organised at the Bessborough site in Cork, and afterwards I took time to look at the debt records of the institution. 923 children died in the care of the nuns in Bessborough. 923. The scale of the suffering here cannot be overstated, and yet only 64 burials are accounted for. The Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes found that it's very likely that the remains of infants are buried on this site. During the 1940s in Ireland, the infant mortality rate was 6.5%. In Bessborough, it was nearly 61%, 10 times higher. The state knew this, and the state turned a blind eye. Officials in the Department of Local Government and Public Health at the time recognised that should Bessborough deaths be leaked to the public, it would, and I quote, result in a public scandal. And all these years later, all we have is a decision to grant planning permission to build apartments on a site that saw so much tragedy. Some of those in power think that this is an issue of the past, and they couldn't be more wrong. The survivors of Bessborough have never received justice. Families are still looking for information and answers. And this isn't just Bessborough. If the planning permission goes through here, it sets a precedent for the use of other grounds and other institutions, such as Shanross Abbey, Castle Pollard, where burials also remain unaccounted for. Minister, these children matter, the survivors matter, our history matters. The government cannot treat this like a normal planning application and sit idly by as concrete is poured over graves. Despite what government might say, our reckoning with this dark period of our history is not over. It's crucially important that future generations understand what happened here and elsewhere. We need a full investigation of the grounds of Bessborough. This should be followed by sensitive excavation on the site, and it should then be subject to a compulsory purchase order to establish a memorial for all those who suffered. Minister, you mentioned the museum in Dublin, but survivors elsewhere across the country, including in Cork, also need a space and not just an apartment complex. Minister, every attempt to reckon with this period of our history has been deeply flawed. Time and again, successive governments have failed survivors. This cycle must end, and that starts by you intervening and stopping this plan application in Bessborough. Abuse cannot and must not be sounded over.
I want to welcome to the gallery people who were incarcerated in Bessborough and other institutions, and I want to particularly welcome Councillor Noel Brown, who was born in Bessborough and who has been an activist for decades in this area. And Noel has tirelessly highlighted the wrong done in this country. Minister, we are at a tipping point in how we acknowledge and make amends for our history and the large-scale human rights abuses that took place in mother and baby institutions. The incarceration of women and the forced disappearance of their infants and children, either through death or forced adoption, has left a legacy that affects not only survivors but us as a nation. Thanks to Catherine Corliss, we finally have a sensitive excavation taking place in Tuam. It signalled to survivors that these children mattered not only to their families and mothers, but also to this country itself. The news that planning permission was granted at Bessborough, the site of another mass grave, caused deep pain for survivors of that institution and sent shockwaves to survivors of other institutions, where thousands of children's burials were also unaccounted for. The recent protest outside the Dáil and the phenomenal public support that followed illustrates clearly that the people of Ireland want the remains of the children in Bessborough dealt with equally sensitively as that of Tuam. The stories told by survivors were absolutely heartbreaking, and they have been re-traumatised by this planning permission. A second protest by students and teachers from Larkin Community College was a tender and sincere questioning of why Bessborough children don't matter. These young people, these students from that school, made paper hearts with the names of the children who have, the 923 children who are buried, well, disposed of there, and the cruel way that each one of them died. Now, Minister, it would take me 45 minutes to read out the names of every one of those 923 children. The children of Bessborough weren't buried, they were disposed of, in a hope that they would be forgotten and never recovered. And the plan to build on that mass grave is a double cruelty at a time when we should know better. This is not who we are as a country, this is not who we are as a nation, and it is not what we want as a country to see this happen. The children of Larkin Community College have been very clear in what they want. They want to make sure that every one of those children is valued and loved and remembered, not only by their families, but us as a country. I have more time? Sorry. This is not, I suppose, this is well documented that Bessborough was a cruel and cold place for every mother and every child incarcerated there. And to have them subjected to this cruelty at their most vulnerability can never be forgotten. To leave a mother grieving the loss of her child for decades with no grave to visit, and then to have them subjected to this cruelty at their most vulnerability can never be forgotten. to leave a mother grieving the loss of her child for decades with no grave to visit and then to decide to concrete over a sensitive site is a modern cruelty that has no place in Ireland in 2026. It is not who we are as a nation.
Ceann Comhairle, I'm very conscious that this will be my last contribution, and I'm sure others, before we head off for the Easter holidays. And as part of those Easter celebrations, particular residents in Ireland, because we'll go celebrate the parts of our history where we are valiant. We will probably visit commemoration sites and read testimony on walls about a nation which proudly professed to cherish all of its children equally. I hope those of us who are also at those commemorations can reflect upon the motion that's before us now and think about 923 children who absolutely were not held to that standard. Children whose names and the fact that they existed we know through birth cert, but of how they died, were they allowed to rest, we know nothing of. And we all know that history has a continuum to it. When you go to those commemorations, when we speak of being part of a Republican ilk, we know that each one of those lines has a line to it. And the failures that befell those babies in Bessborough, similar to the women and children who were incarcerated, forced to engage in vaccine trials, had forced adoptions placed upon them, cruelly treated, they were failed. But we also become part of that failure when we become complicit in the cover-up. When we pour cement to ensure that we can never actually establish the facts, we never able to find their little bodies. We ourselves in this chamber become part of that continuum of failure that led to a state in which a reckoning that we truly don't have of ourselves. So as a nation, I firmly believe that we are defined not only by what we choose to commemorate, but by how we choose to commemorate it. In the next 2 weeks, we're going to go and talk about the parts of our history where we're valiant. But at the same time, we're going to be complicit in a scenario where we pour cement over a place where 923 babies are buried as a failure of our own history.
Margaret, Ceann Comhairle, and I want to speak to what I think is the nub of the issue in terms of the outrage I think that is currently being experienced within the survivor community, and that is this government and successive governments' treatment of victims of state wrongdoing. Because what you need to display is compassion, humility, understanding, and that is just not coming through. And it hasn't come through in terms of the survivors of industrial schools, Magdalene Laundry's mother and baby homes, symphysiotomy. I mean, the list goes on. Instead, what we see is a very litigious, very legally minded, legally focused response to victims of state wrongdoing. And ultimately, an attitude of waiting for people to die out, for the problem to simply die. In my last role, in my last organisation, I advised the Interdepartmental Working Group on the Commission on the redress programme for the Commission of Investigation for Mother and Baby Homes. And that was one of my main messages within that forum, was that there was too much dominance of legal thinking and too little humility and compassion. In that exercise, I listened to survivors of mother and baby homes. And I was also struck by how many of them have shaped their lives around their experiences. These are people who have gone and got qualifications in human rights so that they can argue their case. They have fought for decades for justice, to be seen, to be heard, and essentially will die, many of them, before they ever see it. So this, for me, is just another demonstration, another display of this government's failure to grasp that concept, that when we as a state have so brutally failed a group of people, that we must go in utter humility. You as a government must go in utter humility with absolute compassion when you engage with people and when you treat with all of these issues. And building, concreting over the site of a mother and baby home is just so far from that, that it really is horrific.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy John Paul O'Shea.
I rise today to speak about the matter that goes to the heart of how we, as a state, reckon with our past and how we respond to those who continue to live with its consequences. The focus today is on the history of Bessborough and the wider legacy of the mother and baby institutions in this country. Bessborough was one of a network of institutions that operated for decades in Ireland, taking in women and girls, many of them very young, who found themselves pregnant outside of marriage. Those women were often sent there in circumstances not for their choosing, And once inside, they experienced a system that was harsh, isolating, and in many cases deeply traumatic. These were separated from their families, from their communities, and in many cases from their children. Their voices were not heard, their rights were not respected, and their experiences were, for far too long, hidden from public view. Children born in Bessborough, like those born in similar institutions across the state, faced their own stark realities. Many were adopted, often without full or informed consent from their mothers. Others remained in the institution for periods of time, and tragically, in Bessborough, many did not survive. For decades, the story of these women and children were not spoken about openly. There was silence. There was silence at a societal level, silence at an institutional level, and silence that was imposed on those who lived through those experiences. It is only in more recent years, through the courage and persistence of survivors, that the full extent of what happened in places like Bessborough has become to light. The establishment of the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Babies Homes was a significant step in that process. Its final report provided an important record and acknowledgement of what occurred. It documented the conditions within those institutions and the experiences of those who were there. However, as we know, reports alone cannot answer every question, nor can they address every concern. The legacy of our mother and baby institutions remains one of the most painful chapters in our state's history. While the government's action plan for survivors and former residents is a step in the right direction, we must be honest and say it does not go far enough, particularly when it comes to the protection of unrecorded burial sites. The request from the Minister for Housing for Local Government and Heritage to local authorities, including Cork City Council, to consider these sites within the development plans is welcome, but consideration alone is not enough. These are not ordinary planning matters. They are sacred sites, places of memory, and in many cases the only resting place of vulnerable people, children and women whose dignity was denied in life. We need stronger, clearer protections to ensure that unrecorded burial sites is ever disturbed, overlooked or lost to development. The state must lead here with urgency and compassion, because how we treat these sites today reflects how seriously we take the injustices of the past. We must remember that this is not simply about land or surveys. It's about people. It's about mothers who were denied agency over their lives. It's about children who were separated from their families. It's about those who died and those whose resting places may not be fully known. It is also about trust in the state to do what is right, even when it's difficult. Trust in our institutions to engage honestly with the past. And trust that the voices of survivors will continue to be heard. The government's action plan rightly recognises the importance of dignified local memorialisation of known and agreed burial sites. This is not simply a policy commitment, it's a moral obligation to those who were lost, to the families and communities that have carried that pain for generations. While I welcome the establishment of the working group by the Minister for Housing and Local Government and Heritage, what is now needed is the urgency and delivery. Survivors have waited long enough for recognition, respect and tangible action on the ground. We must ensure that this process is truly inclusive and it is survivor-led, with their voices at the very centre of the decision-making process. But consultation alone is not enough. Clear timelines, adequate resources and visible progress is essential. I'm urging the government here today to move swiftly from commitment to implementation, to support local communities in creating appropriate memorials and to ensure that these sites are treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve. I am aware that planning permission has recently been granted by Cork City Council for a housing development on the Bessborough site. And while I acknowledge that a number of conditions have been attached to this permission, including the requirement to have a forensic archaeological monitoring strategy and the presence of a forensic archaeologist during excavation, I must state clearly that, in my personal view, proceeding in this manner is fundamentally wrong. Where there is even the slightest possibility that burial remains may be located on this site, where planning permission has been approved, assurances should have been confirmed as part of that planning process that no burials have taken place on that portion of land. That did not happen here, and that is a serious concern for me. Yes, the conditions provide that the work must cease if remains are discovered and that the relevant authorities must be notified. But we should not be relying on discovery during construction. We should be ensuring beyond doubt, before any permission is granted, that such deeply sensitive issues have been fully examined. It is now a matter for an Comisiún Peannála to determine how this application proceeds from here. I would urge that body to take the utmost care and to ensure that respect, dignity and the due process are at the heart of any decision made. This is not just a planning issue, it is a matter of historical responsibility and human decency. Ceann Comhairle, the history of Bessborough is not just local history, it's part of our national story. It reflects a time where vulnerable women and children were failed by the very systems that were meant to protect them. Acknowledging that history is essential. Learning from it is essential, but so too is ensuring that we continue to respond to its legacy. We cannot change what happened in the past, but we can decide how we deal with it now. We can choose to listen, we can choose to act, and we can choose to ensure that no legitimate concern is left unanswered. In doing so, Ceann Comhairle, we honour those who lived through those experiences and those who did not live to tell their story.
We will move now to Deputy Ruth Coppinger.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Minister, it's an outrage that planning permission will be given on this site where over 900 children that we know of died, but only 64 graves have ever been found, happening despite all of the campaigning of survivors and the groups connected with them. Now, I want to just mention something that the Minister for Justice said in the Dáil here the other day when it was raised with him. He basically acted like hands in the air, government powerless, terrible altogether. He used the words, the government cannot interfere in respect of planning applications. Of course it can. I mean, the government can actually submit, it could object, the Minister could object to the planning application. For example, have you done that? But as well as that, this is just part of a pattern of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the two parties that were in power for over the 100 years when all of this happened, allowing the church off the hook because you don't want the history examined of your role in all of this. That's the conclusion we have to draw. And, you know, the idea that the government's powerless, you were in passing emergency laws for the hauliers, you know, in the last couple of nights here. You could have passed emergency laws. That land should never have been allowed to be sold by that congregation. You should have made sure of that. And just who's the congregation? Sacred Heart of Jesus and Mary. As of last year, the congregations involved in ongoing discussions with yourselves regarding financial contributions to a redress scheme for survivors, with reports indicating that they have resisted demands for payment on the grounds that they did not act in an untoward manner. This is despite the fact that there's an 80% death rate in some of the years of the existence of the home, obviously not all of the years. They were asked for 96.5 million. They've assets of 37 million, right? I'm rounding the figures up. And they have almost 2 million in cash in the bank. The nuns sold this site in 2021 and they pocketed 6.85 million. That's your fault. That never should have happened. Fianna Fáil let them away with murder on this since the 1990s, and you could have intervened to put a law into effect where no congregations could sell any site where there was potential graves of survivors. This is an outrage. So the Clon project has pointed out you're legally bound by the European Court of Human Rights to find any bodies that exist and bring them back, you know, in a suitable manner for the families of those affected. Bessborough was a site of systemic oppression. and you have made sure that that hasn't actually happened. So in the letter, they point out that planning permission was refused here on a number of times. So you knew this was going to happen eventually, and I'd say you're happy. You're happy to have this built over so that it's another chapter finished for you. And they pointed out that under the European legislation, investigating deaths of children, mothers, ascertaining the whereabouts of the disappeared and returning the remains to relatives is part of your human rights obligations, which you haven't complied with. The Commission of Investigation into the Mother and Baby Homes, I wasn't in the Dáil when that came out, but I remember reading it and going, here we go again, another whitewash. That report shouldn't be cited, as it should have been voted down by the government, because so much of it was so mild in its manner towards the people running the homes. It didn't use all reasonable means to search for the disappeared children. Let's put that one away. So some of the means will be geophysical surveys, radar, electrical resistivity and magnetometry. The Special Advocate, and I'll just finish on this, for survivors has called for you to stop. Someone you appointed yourself. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are trying to bury the truth here. And you're happy that a private developer is putting this out of the way for you.
Deputy Richard Boyd-Barrett.
Can I first of all just pay tribute to Carmel Cantwell, and I see Noel Brown there in the gallery, and other survivors and those affected by the crimes that were committed at Bessborough Mother and Baby Institution. I called it a home at the protest last week, and I was rightly rounded upon and told it should be called an institution, because there were institutions of brutality and oppression that traumatised and stigmatised women, brutalised them, and of course led to the deaths of hundreds of children, 923 children, a horrific stain. And over the next few weeks we'll be celebrating the Irish Revolution, the 1916 Rising. And one of the greatest, in my opinion, the greatest Irish revolutionary, statues up behind us, James Connolly, revolutionary and socialist, warned that if the country was partitioned, it would lead to a carnival of reaction north and south. And Connolly was very consciously an advocate for women's liberation, and believed that if the Irish struggle for freedom didn't liberate women, it would be a hollow victory. And when he was warning about the carnival of reaction that would result from partition, he was very specifically worried about what would happen to women in a partitioned Ireland, where reactionary forces gained dominance in the state. And so it's appropriate that Bessborough was set up in 1922, the year of partition, as part of a policy by the new state of outsourcing the care of women and children to the Catholic Church, who then ran institutions where in one year, 3 out of 4 children died, many of them of starvation. I was reading Donald O'Keefe from the Echo, sent me an article today about the fact that in 1947 the state chief medical officer, actually his papers have revealed that a threatened investigation by the state into 700 deaths at the time in Bessborough was abandoned if there was a commitment to reduce the number of deaths of children to single digits. Right? It's horrendous. What was going on. So they didn't investigate at the time. Deaths continued, although they did reduce. But the sort of dark stain we're talking about and the history of this state, and in its treatment of women and children, its stigmatisation of women because they didn't comply with a sort of twisted notion of morality, and then the actual deaths of children, hundreds of whom still their burial place unaccounted for. It's unbelievable. And the idea that we would go from that to prioritising the interests of property developers, I mean, says it all about the carnival of reaction that Connolly warned, that we go from this killing of children effectively starvation of children, buried in unmarked graves, the disappearance of children to property developers profiting, and we can't do anything about it, even though we're, trampling on the sensitivities of people who've been brutalised in these horrific institutions. And I was saying at the protest last week, I was born in a mother and baby home. I went recently with my mother to try and find the place. It was in Highgate, North London, and we couldn't find it. Now, look, I've been reunited with my mother, and, the outcome has been a good one. But I met somebody at the protest, and she said it's okay to mention her name, Sarah, who's from Cork, who was also, it turned out, she said to me afterwards, she said, I was born in the Highgate mother and baby home, which we didn't manage to find. And that mattered to me, and it matters to her, and I got some messages from other people who said, we were born in Highgate, we were disappeared to England, and then sort of quietly brought back to be adopted. But our outcomes are okay. But Sarah was born in Highgate and then was in Bessborough. So she's out there protesting, sort of a second generation of people affected by all of this. So the thought that we're going to build on this site, that the government won't intervene to compensate for the failure of this state, to women and children, hundreds of women and children who lie buried in unmarked graves, and the trauma that is inflicted on the survivors and those affected is horrendous. You can do it. As has been said, you could lodge an objection. Deputy Commissioner is absolutely right. You should intervene and prevent the crime being compounded for those who suffered in these institutions.
Thank you. And just before I move to ask the Minister to speak, I want to advise members that 14 deputies submitted matters under Standing Order 39 for topical questions, and we'll have a double session of topical questions this evening. The deputies in question are Deputy Marie Sherlock to the Minister for Housing, Local Government and Heritage, Deputy Sinead Gibney to the Minister for Housing, Local Government and Heritage, Deputy Michael Murphy to the Minister for Health, Deputy Paul Murphy and Liam Quaid to the Minister for Health, Deputy Brian Stanley to the Minister for Transport, Deputy Circa Clark to the Minister for Education and Youth, Deputy Darren O'Rourke to the Minister for Education and Youth, and Deputy Cathy Bennett to the Minister for Climate, Energy and the Environment. Topicals will take place immediately after this debate. Thank you. Now, Minister, I'm calling you to make your concluding remarks, please. Not more than 10 minutes.
Thank you, Cancor, and I thank all my colleagues for their contributions here today. As Minister Foley set out earlier, the investigation of burial arrangements in mother and babies institutions, including Bessborough, was an important part of the work of the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes, an independent statutory body established in 2015. Indeed, one of the key reasons of its establishment was to look at the burial practices and arrangements in the various institutions. The Commission was given the necessary powers to conduct a thorough investigation of the matters covered by its terms of reference, including the power of compellability and the power to inspect private premises. The initial contribution set out the extensive investigations undertaken by the Commission in an effort to locate the burials of children who died while resident in Bessborough. The Commission's investigation into burial practices extended to many other institutions beyond Bessborough. This included the former institutions at Castle Pollard and Sean Ross. These two institutions were run by the same order that ran the institution at Bessborough. However, unlike Bessborough, there were designated child burial grounds in Castle Pollard and Sean Ross. The Commission found that there is no legal requirement to keep a register of burials in such private burial grounds, and that none seem to exist. The Commission's investigation at Castle Pollard included a review of an archaeological assessment of the Castle Pollard burial ground that was carried out in 2017 on behalf of the HSC, which currently owns the site. The assessment concluded there was sufficient space in the burial ground for the number of children who died there. The Commission also investigated burial arrangements at Sean Ross. It used its investigative powers and issued a warrant so that a forensic investigation of the burial ground could be undertaken. It did this in response to information that it had received that the graveyard, when still in use, had drainage works inserted through it, and that, based on this assertion, there may be no remains at the site and it may never have been used as a graveyard. Site surveys, review of planning files and an independent drain inspection was followed by a forensic standard test evacuation, with multiple trenches opened in the areas across the site
where anomalies were identified by the surveys. The investigation found that the coffined infant burials were located across the designated burial ground and that these had not been impacted by drainage works. The Commission concluded that no further investigation was warranted. The report and investigation was published in full in the Commission's final report, with the survey and drain inspections report included as appendices. Following publication of the Commission's report, the former Minister for Children engaged with a local group in Sean Ross and provided funding for them to conduct a survey of land beside the institution's burial ground, land that was not investigated by the Commission. That survey showed no clear evidence of burials. We are outlining all of this information today so the deputies are aware of the extent of the work undertaken by the Commission into the burial practices at mother and baby institutions across the country. I can understand how traumatic and frustrating the continued uncertainty regarding the burial place of children who died at Bessborough must be for the families of those children. Indeed, it is troubling for the whole of Irish society and highlights in a particularly emotive way the disregard with which women and children were treated in this country throughout most of the last century. I believe it is crucial that there is respectful memorialisation of Bessborough site so that we never forget what happened there. I expect that Cork City Council is giving due consideration to this matter, and I would urge that the survivors and family members are centrally involved into any process around this. If a location of burials at Bessborough site is uncovered in the future, the Government already have the necessary legislation in place to deal with such findings through the provisions of the Institutional Burials Act 2022. This provides for forensic standard evacuation of those remains for excavation, of those remains or for the appropriate memorialisation in line with the wishes of survivors and family members. Earlier, Minister Foley mentioned a number of actions in the Government's action plan to respond to the priority needs and concerns of survivors, former residents and their families. These included those related to national and local memorialisation, protection of burial grounds, the implementation of the Institutional Burials Act and the appointment of a director to oversee the excavation, recovery, analysis, identification and reburial of the children's remains at the tomb site. Other actions in the plan where there had been significant progress include the introduction of the Birth Information and Tracing Act, the appointment of a special advocate for survivors and the opening of the Mother and Baby Institutions Payment Scheme. Access to records, in particular, is consistently highlighted as an important issue in an ongoing engagement with survivors and affected people. A person's right to their identity is an important human right, and every person should have full access to all of his or her information where available. In this regard, the landmark Birth Information and Tracing Act 2022 introduced a full and clear right of access to birth certificates and birth and early life information for all persons who have questions in relation to their origins. More than 17,500 applications for information has been completed since services opened in October 2022. The new law also contained provision in respect of access by an next of kin to records of a child who died in an institution. In addition, it established a statutory tracing service, a contact preference register, new powers to ensure safeguarding of relevant records, and a range of new bespoke measures to address issues arising for people affected by illegal birth registrations. The Department has also published information indicating what personal data it holds and how to request access to it via a subject access request. A dedicated phone line provides information for callers on the subject access request process, and the information on this is also regularly communicated to survivors and former residents via quarterly updates on the action plan. Further legislation to provide for the preservation of privately held records related to Ireland's institutional past came into force in 2024. This was introduced in response to calls from survivors and affected persons, their families and advocates, who want to ensure that records which support understanding of their identity and the institutional systems which have shaped their life experiences in such significant way are preserved. While the legislation doesn't provide for access to privately held records by mandating preservation, it ensures that future access to these records is not rendered impossible. I hope this shows Government's clear commitment to implementing actions that respond to the priority needs of survivors and the legacy of Ireland's institutional past.
And that concludes the statements on Bessborough development.